Keeping your bike clean and well lubed is a key to making sure your transmission works really well, and also for ensuring longevity of your bike. But it can be quite confusing because there's a lot of different greases and lubes available on the market, and more specifically it can be quite confusing where specifically you use them on the bike. So here's our guide to different greases, Threadlock compounds and lubes out there and where you should be using them. So obviously there's a lot of stuff available to you out there, but this is the bare minimum that you really should be having to look after your bike at home. So you're going to need some sort of water displacer. Now you'd use these after cleaning your bike just to drive out the water from your transmission to make sure it can't rust. And also if you're just riding your bike in wet conditions to have the same effect. Then you're going to need some sort of chain lube. There's various different ones on the market which we're going to explain to you later. You're going to need these to lubricate your transmission to make sure all those rollers on the chain work nicely. A generic sort of spray lube, because you can use these on various places on your bike that you can't get to with a chain lube. And some sort of grease. So first up, you're going to need a chain lube. Now the main types of chain lube come in two options, wet and dry. So wet lube, as the name suggests, is a wet lube, and it's quite a thick viscosity and it sits on your chain, keeping it wet and lubricated at all times. These are ideal for really wet, foul conditions because they stick to the chain really well. But the problem with that is it can attract grit and all the nasty stuff that gunks up. So you do have to pay attention to your drivetrain a little bit more if using this stuff. But the point is, for using in wet conditions, this is what you need because it's also a rust inhibitor. Dry lube, a little bit different. So dry lube, despite what the name is still a wet substance. So it's basically a carrier which is solvent based and it holds the lubricating particles. So you apply this onto your chain and then the solvent itself dries up, making sure those particles have got into the rollers and pins of the chain. So this sort of stuff is not too good in wet conditions because it can be washed away, but due to the dry nature of it, once it's sort of dried onto your chain, it doesn't attract dirt and grime, so it's ideal for dusty conditions. The downside with dry lube, other than it comes off in the wet, is the fact it doesn't last as long, so you're going to need to apply it more frequently. So the main point with all lubricants, and in particular a dry lube, is that they get into the chain rollers themselves. So there are some lubricants on the market that you have to read the manual quite extensively, and you have to wait up to 4 hours before you ride the bike. And I know for a fact that no one is actually going to do that. You just want to apply the lube and get out riding. So make sure you get a decent lubricant. When you put it on, it soaks into the chain properly and it gets all those rollers moist, because that is the backbone of the chain. If they're not lubricated, you're wearing your stuff out. So just invest in a good lubricant, and it's worth having a wet and dry so you can ride in different conditions. So next up is to have a general purpose spray lube. Now these are quite convenient to use, and you can use them due to the wet nature of them as a chain lube, but because they're quite thin, it's never going to last as long. They'll sit somewhere in the middle between a wet and a dry lube, but what these are really useful for is things like brake lever pivots or even the inside of your U-lock if you leave it outside, for example. They're just a really good convenient lubricant to have in your selection, and they can also be used to flush out gear cables. So WD-40 does contain a lubricant, but it's also a solvent, so that means it's going to break down greases and stuff. So what you don't really want to do is have this stuff around bearings and that for too long. However, it's not actually going to create that much damage in the long term as long as you look after your bike, because it is still a lubricant. So you could use this on your chain, although it's never going to be as good as using a dedicated chain lube. So we'd always recommend using a specific chain lube. Just use this to make sure stuff is driven out. Wipe it off with a rag and then lubricate your bike properly with the proper chain lube before you go riding or immediately afterwards. Another thing that WD-40 is brilliant for, and a reason to have this in your toolkit, is it's really good for freeing seized components and locks and stuff. So in particular, I had one last winter, a frozen shifter. So my shifter had just got loads of water in it from just a winter of riding, and gradually it just started getting really, really stiff with use. Flush it out with this, take it apart, clean it, works fantastically. And it's also great for flushing out outer cables, multiple use sort of product. And if you drive to your trails, you might have had sticky car locks before, or even any problems with sort of electrical stuff. This is actually conductive, so it's really good for using with any of that sort of stuff. And finally, the other reason to have this is it's actually really good for getting grease out of carpet and out of clothing, which a lot of people don't realise. I made a really cool hacks video, and you can demonstrate getting some oil out of carpet with it. So great multi-use product just to have in your toolkit. A lightweight spray grease is also another thing really handy to have in your collection, but don't get me wrong, it's not a replacement for heavy duty workshop grease to use on bearings and threads and things like that. It's good for using on pedal threads. You can use it on the lightweight stuff on the inside of shifters, those gubbins that would get bogged down with a thick grease and where an oil will just run out and won't do anything. They're also useful off the bike for a few other things. So your bike rack on the car, for example, where the elbows come up to sort of clamp your down tube, they creak quite a lot. This stuff is great for that, and it doesn't get washed off by sort of rain when you're out driving. So just a good multi-use product, comes in handy, buy it once, stays on the shelf, gets used a few times. You're going to need a decent grease for working on your bike. Now, grease is obviously used to reduce friction between surfaces. It helps keep water at bay, and it's used to generally assemble parts of your bike. So you're going to be using grease in areas like pedal threads, bottom bracket threads, putting the headset cups into the frame. Beware though that some greases contain petroleum and other substances that are damaging to carbon fibre. So before you go smearing some on any carbon parts, make sure it's carbon safe. So first up is lithium grease, which tends to be white by nature. You often see it in big tubs in workshops, and you can also get it in spray cans because it's quite thin stuff. Now, whilst this is good for assembling parts of your bike, it's not the best stuff for general lubrication because it does wash away eventually, so you don't see it used that much. However, like I said, it's great for nestling in cartridge bearings into the frame because it's still going to provide a sort of waterproof barrier, and it's not going to get washed away in a location like that. It's also quite handy to use on wheel axles and things like that, just to make them slide into place and not get corroded. A lot of other common greases you'll see referred to as PTFE or Teflon based greases. Now these have Teflon particles in them, so it's a really good slick grease and it can be used on many places on the bike, but generally a Teflon grease isn't that good for using on carbon fibre, so just be cautious of that if you do buy some. Now these two are quite generic workshop greases here. They're both safe to use on carbon fibre. They're also ideal to use to waterproof parts of your bike and use on any bearings. I tend to just use just a standard tub of this stuff for pretty much everything. So you're also going to need some sort of assembly compound on your bike. So an assembly compound, often referred to as anti-seize or sometimes a carbon compound, is essentially a form of grease and it's got particles suspended in it, and that helps create friction between surfaces. So this is ideal to use in places like your seat post junction, where you want to make sure it doesn't corrode into your frame but also it doesn't move. So the really unique thing about assembly compounds is it can help reduce the torque that you have to put through an Allen key junction, for example, on a handlebar and stem or a seat post in order to hold that component in place. This is particularly important with carbon fibre because you don't want to over tighten those components because you can risk damaging them, and worse, you could actually crack them. So make sure you've got the right sort of assembly compound that is compatible with the sorts of things on your bikes. So there are specific carbon compounds. I mean, this particular one is an all-round compound. It's safe to use with carbon, but you can use it on aluminium, steel, any other materials. Now, some people think you should be using a grease. Something like the Hope system, which is an alloy cup that presses into the frame, it's actually got these sort of bars that hold the cups together. You can use a grease for that because it's not going to sort of walk around or move in there. Now, if you're using plastic cups, I recommend using a specific retaining compound. So this is a form of glue basically that holds it in place, but it's easy enough to get it out afterwards. Just make sure you look up what's recommended for that specific component when you're installing it. Assuming you have some sort of suspension fork or shock on your bike, you're going to want some kind of suspension based grease. Now they're quite specific because they're very thin and very slick, and you'll use these typically in areas like under the fork seal. So it helps create a barrier against the water getting in there and obviously keeps the fork running smoothly. Make sure you get a decent one and make sure it's compatible with your suspension fork. Okay, so next up is Threadlock. It's not something you'll use that often on your bike, but there are very particular places you should be using it. So, for example, chainring bolts is something subject to vibration and rattle out on the trail. If they come loose when you're out riding, it's generally going to ruin your ride. So that is exactly where you're going to want a Threadlock. Other places worth considering to use Threadlock are the jockey wheel bolts that hold your rear mech cage together, your actual rear mech hanger bolt itself, and if your bike has removable dropouts, you'll find it will have some kind of retaining bolt to keep those on. Definitely want to keep those Threadlocks so they don't rattle loose. And finally, something that I often see loose on people's bikes, are brake lever pivot bolts. So you'd never really think of checking those, but they rattle loose, and if your brake lever falls off, you're going to know about that. So this one's a bit of an odd one. This is brake grease. So It's a grease obviously for assembling your brake components like the calipers, and the only difference really between this and a normal grease is it's dot proof. So that refers to the style of fluid used in a lot of brakes. That's DOT, and it's a corrosive liquid. If you use regular grease, then it's going to break down. So this is specifically formulated just to avoid doing that. You'll barely ever need to use this stuff, but if you are quite an in-depth home mechanic, it's good to have in the toolkit nonetheless. So next up are suspension oils and lubricants. So firstly, the oils, you're probably less likely to use these at home because they involve taking the oil out of the damping unit itself. And these come in different oil weights, and that refers to the viscosity of the actual oil. So in addition to the external adjustments you can make to those damping units, you can use different weight oil to control the characteristics of your suspension fork or shock. Quite a specialist part, and you will find with every fork and shock there'll be a recommended weight oil to use. Of course, you can sort of custom tune that by running different oils. Next up is suspension lubricant. Now this has no bearing on the damping of the fork or shock itself whatsoever. It's purely used to lubricate. In this case, this is just a lower leg lube. So this will go in the lower leg of the fork, and its job is to make sure it slides up and down nicely to keep the seals nice and moist, and also to make sure the bushings don't wear too prematurely. And this stuff is Fox float fluid. It's basically the same equivalent for using on Fox products, and in particular Fox rear shocks. It's not a damping oil, it's just there to lubricate the seals. And finally, with suspension products, you can also use that lower leg lube just to perform a quick sort of wipe of your upper legs. But you can also use this stuff. It's a silicone spray, and this is amazing stuff. It's super thin. So you can actually get this under the wiper seals if you just roll up the garter, and you can just use this just to keep your forks running smooth on a day-to-day basis. So hopefully our breakdown of lubricants, greases and retaining compounds has been helpful for you. If you want to find out a few more cool videos on how to use these sort of things, click down here for installing a press fit bottom bracket, where I demonstrate some retaining compounds and stuff down there. And if you want to find out about fork lower leg service using some of the products here, click down here. As always, click on the globe to subscribe in the middle. And of course, if it's been a useful video, give us a thumbs up.